Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. This is my first time in Hong Kong, so I'm really excited to see the city and to meet everybody. So thanks for coming. And I'm going to be talking today about Free Range's approach to storytelling. And we're a creative agency that does a lot of branding and marketing work for nonprofits and socially responsible companies. And when you think about advertising and marketing, marketers are, in a lot of ways, the storytellers of the modern day. And so we take our responsibility very seriously because we believe that marketing should be for positive causes, for change making. And so we kind of turned the model of the typical ad agency on its head, and instead of advertising products, we like to advertise and push ideas that are going to change the way people look at things, the way people think about things. So I'm going to be talking today about our philosophy about storytelling and to give you guys some tips on how you can think about it if you're wanting to do this kind of work and if you want to work with organizations who are trying to tell stories in this way as well. So ancient and modern storytelling tools. Ancient because we really believe that mythology is at the root of this. Free Range was inspired by the work of a man named Joseph Campbell, who is a modern American philosopher and a mythologist who really believed in the power of archetypes and the power of story to communicate universal truths. So when you're talking about storytelling for change, the question came up last night. Somebody in the audience asked, during Peter's session, somebody asked, well, how do you actually get people to do things differently? And if you look at media and storytelling as an effective tool for that, you've got to think about, well, what is it about stories that make people change? What is it about stories that can make people inspired to do something different than they might have done before? And in the world of sustainability and sustainable messaging and trying to get information out about these issues, you might think that just educating people about the topics is enough to actually get them to do something. But you find that that's actually not the case. We are kind of hardwired in certain ways, and one of the ways that we're hardwired is we're pretty much designed to work in communities of 50 to 150 people. This is based on the idea, this theory about Dunbar's number, which is that there's a limit to the number of people with whom we can socialize that would actually have impactful social change. Even in the world that we live in now that's so connected via the internet and everything, you find that the actual groups of people with whom you make the most change are the ones that are in your more immediate community. So you start thinking about, well, how many people can I reach? How am I wired to communicate? And who are the people with whom I want to communicate? The other thing is, we're also wired to avoid things that are dangerous right in front of us. It's very difficult to communicate about, carbon in the atmosphere. That's not something that we grasp in a really tangible way. So the things that do make us act, do make us take action, are stories that really are inspired by values. And, values that we can identify with, places that we can really see ourselves in the story. A big part of our philosophy at Free Range is you need to be able to communicate with people in such a way that they feel like your story is talking to them, that they can be identified in it, that they can actually become the hero of the story. We're also drawn to archetypes, so characters like the hero, the villain, the trickster, so finding ways to incorporate those kinds of characters into your stories. And as well as stories that are populated with everyday heroes. So now in the world of internet and media storytelling in this way that everybody is a media producer, you start thinking about, well, what's the story that identifies your neighbor, a story that someone who you would recognize, somebody you can totally identify with, who would also be considered a hero. And so I'm going to be talking about a couple things, the broadcast model versus the narrowcast model. But when you look at a personal lifestyle change, that can come through, you could watch something on television, and that might inspire you to change. And the adoption of a new way of thinking a willingness to take on an identity and to actually become an evangelist of a particular message or a change that we're trying to convey. And that actually comes through the narrowcast model. And the narrowcast model is basically the internet, the ability, and mobile, and the ability to pass and become a participant in media creation. So here's a quote from Joseph Campbell, who I mentioned earlier on. This is something to think about for a minute. Myths are public dreams. Dreams are private myths. It's kind of a nice quote to meditate on. Joseph Campbell was also famous for the phrase, follow your bliss. He really believed that people had the right and the duty to really follow their creativity, to follow what the universe was calling them to do, to express themselves that way. So if we think about mythology as the public's dream, it's kind of a beautiful way to think about stories in our culture. So again, the idea that human beings live on human scale, when you think about telling a story or writing a story or communicating something, think about it from that human scale. How are you going to be able to relate to those 50 to 150 people? What does that look like in a storytelling context? And we don't see our world, we don't actually see what's in front of us. We see our world through the filter of stories. So when we look around, we're making up narratives constantly. So if we're making up narratives constantly, then that means that we have incredible creative potential. At Free Range, we really believe that the stories that you tell are what manifest in the world. It's a powerful ability to tell a story. It's a powerful ability to put a vision out into the world. So really think about what that story is that you want to be out there. So we're going to talk about creating stories. And here's Jonah Sachs, who's the co-founder of Free Range, said this quote, "Marketers will need to draw on the main lessons learned by consumer marketing in the 1950s. Facts alone do not sell behavior change. Instead, people working to foster sustainable behavior must use storytelling to reach audiences on a human, personal scale." So again, this is a really important shift around the philosophy of marketing, the idea of sustainable marketing. When you're trying to get people to be inspired, most marketers, are trying to operate from a place of fear or a place of lack. When you look at advertising, typically they're telling you that you're not pretty enough, you don't have enough. You basically need more and more and more. That's a lot of the philosophy of old school advertising. And our approach to this is we really want to use marketing to put positive messages out there. So what is it, and think about that. It's really an interesting thing to think about, which is what would it look like if advertisements were actually inspiring you to do something that you felt empowered to do? What would that feel like if they weren't coming at you from the perspective of what you need to feel cooler, etc.? And when you look at that, and you look at the field of sustainability, and if you're interested in going into sustainability from the perspective of this positive marketing framework, then there are a lot of opportunities. Some of the opportunities and how storytelling translates into this with marketing is that you don't have some of the same obstacles that you might have in traditional advertising. So if you're doing marketing or doing storytelling work for a nonprofit, for a socially responsible company, or for a company that's taken on, the responsibility to really change the way it's doing business in the world, to be more responsible and to be, to advocate for the environment, then you're going to have a few things on your side. You're going to have the ability for the motivation of what you do for your work to be in alignment with your messages. So the messages that you put out into the public are not going to be in conflict with what your internal motivations are to be doing that. That's a really nice thing, actually, to have those two things aligned. Authenticity is really important. The voice that you're using needs to be authentic, and people can feel when something is authentic. It feels good to be able to walk the talk, to be able to stand behind what you're saying, and to be actually living those values. And and transparency is a really important thing in business these days. The idea that you kind of peel back the layers, and you're actually willing to show people more things about your company or your organization than you may your old paradigm way doing things. So you're willing to be kind of vulnerable in that regard. So those are some of the opportunities, but then there are challenges that come with this as well. A lot of times, and free range works really hard to avoid this, that when you're messaging about things where you're trying to create change in the world, you know, these issues are serious and they can be depressing and difficult to face, you know, day in and day out. So how do you talk about them in such a way that you uplift people? We really believe that humor is really important. You know, we do a lot of animation. We use animations with animal characters. We use, you know, funny techniques to get these stories out there. And humor is a really powerful way of getting things to stick for people and for it to feel like they can connect to it. You don't want to feel preachy. You don't want to feel like you're, you know, telling people what to do, because that's contrary to that idea of inviting somebody in to be a participant in the story, for the audience to be, you know, to become part of it. Authenticity. You know, again, if we're talking about being vulnerable and we're talking about being human and we're talking about trying to run a business or an organization, sometimes you don't really know who you are yet. Maybe you're in a process of trying to figure that out. Maybe you're in the process of growing and evolving. So it might be difficult to pinpoint what it is that you want to say about yourself. But the goal of authenticity is really important. And then transparency. Yeah, transparency, you know, you can get nailed for it. I mean, you're showing things, you're being willing to be vulnerable, you know, and it's a frightening thing to do sometimes. But you've got to be, you know, a leader in that, and you've got to pioneer in that spirit. So, some key lessons: populate your stories with archetypes. Again, invite the viewer into the process. Make the viewer part of the story. Help them to identify themselves in it. This is really important. This is what I was saying before. No matter how incredible the vision might be, no matter how improbable it seems, no matter how impossible it might seem, be bold enough to put a vision out there that you believe in. A lot of times we do pieces that are set in the future, because that's a really fun way to frame a story. If you say, okay, well, here's a fake documentary about some success that happened. Here was a big environmental success, and you show it. It can be a really powerful way of making that happen. We did a piece for an organization in the United States called Renew US, and it was about climate change, and it was about people adopting new ways of doing things. And we made the film in 2005, and at one point in the documentary we had a clip about the unlikely Obama and McCain ticket that would happen, you know, in the most recent election. But that was Obama and McCain running together because we were being really bold in our vision and thinking that those two men could actually come together as a unified force. But it was pretty funny to look at that piece, and then, you know, a few years later, here's Obama, you know, and now he's the president of the United States. So be bold, be willing to put something out there that might seem kind of improbable. Always find a hero in the story. People want to connect to that main character. And this is another thing that we really believe in, which is, you know, take complicated issues. Don't be afraid to tackle complex topics, and do it in a way where you simplify it, but you don't dumb it down. You want to be able to hold on to the key pieces of information, you know, the key nuggets of truth. Keep that in there, but make it simple and engaging, and just keep it to the bare facts like that. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit more into narrowcast versus broadcast. You know, stories in our modern age, broadcast, basically, the TV, TV is the main vehicle for telling stories. Obviously, we know where that's going. In that model, the audience is basically just being projected at. Like, this is a big difference between, you know, the way media used to be and how it's changed. The idea that the storyteller is the person who's the expert. The idea that if I'm making this piece of movie, this piece of media, then I know something that you don't know. And it's not really possible for the message to shift or for the story to evolve or change. Now, the world of transmedia is winning. Transmedia means basically that was a term that's been coined by a professor in the United States named Henry Jenkins, who used to do a lot of work with MIT. And transmedia basically means kind of non-linear storytelling across platforms, where you really invite a lot of participants to be part of the creation of that story. Uses the internet and mobile devices, customized for each audience. This is really important when you're creating a piece, like a whole campaign, where you might have multiple groups that want to be involved. You've got to think about who your different demographics are and who it is that you want to target in that story, so that you can figure out a way to speak to those different audiences within the piece. The other thing that's crucial, the audience has total freedom. They can click, the average amount of time that someone spends on a piece of media on the internet is just a fraction of time, so you've got to make sure that your piece is compelling and grabs people right off the bat. The storyteller shares authority. Again, this is the idea that the storyteller is really, who you're creating the media for. The community of people are actually all media creators and all participants in that storytelling process. And the message is fluid. The message can change. The message can shift. One of the things that we do at Free Range, and one of the things we're known for, are viral films. I mean, that's kind of I'm not a huge fan of the word viral, but the idea that someone can be an evangelist for a message, and this is a really important part. Some of our pieces that have been really successful have been because we've figured out, the core of the story, and this is the model that basically demonstrates that, the core is the message, like the piece that you're passionate about. And we believe that once you identify what that is, the audience that's going to be most likely to pass it along to be your evangelists are the choir. The people who are really passionate about this issue, but they've just been missing a tool, like they haven't had a piece of media that helps to encapsulate what it is that they're excited about. So you find that audience and you turn them into your viral, your folks that are going to help pass the message along. Then outside the choir, you have the persuadables. These are the people who are right on the fence. Maybe they know something about the issue, but they haven't quite become really activated around it, but they're ready. They're right at that tipping point. And so once the persuadables have been brought into the story, then you reach out to the general public. A lot of times people will come to us and they'll say, all right, well, you've made these viral pieces. Like, I want to reach the general audience. And that's always a tricky question to answer, because you can't really approach storytelling in that way. You can't say, okay, I want it to reach as many people as possible. Again, you've got to really think about who it is that are really passionate about this and how can that message be passed along. So just a recap in terms of doing this yourself. Make sure to identify your audience. Find emotionally resonant themes. Come to the process with an innocence. Be willing to go into it when you meet with people as if you haven't heard this before, this information before. It's really important in the creative process to have that blank slate and to be able to be, a sounding board and to go into the brainstorming process in that kind of innocent way. And also be patient. Know that just because you get a piece out that's about this issue, or just because you start spreading this message, it takes time to really saturate the community with this information. Set your stage, find your heroes, find your main characters, find the archetypes, and think about how the audience can join. Choose your mysteries and your metaphors, and your medium. So at Free Range, we do both live action video and we also do animation, and sometimes those things can be appropriate depending on what the cause is and what the project is. So now I'm going to show you some actual clips of some films. The first film that I'm going to show you a few minutes of is a famous piece of ours called The Story of Stuff. Some of you may have seen it. I'm just going to show a few minutes because the entire piece is 20 minutes, and I don't want to take up the whole talk with just that one piece. So we're going to watch like the first 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'll go through some of the results of this piece and some of the successes and talk about it, to give you a little bit of an insight in how it became a viral hit. So if we can play like the first few minutes of Story of Stuff, that'd be great. I think the sound is off.
Do you have one of these? I got a little obsessed with mine. In fact, I got a little obsessed with all my stuff. Have you ever wondered where all the stuff we buy comes from and where it goes when we throw it out? I couldn't stop wondering about that, so I looked it up. And what the textbook said is that stuff moves through a system from extraction to production to distribution to consumption to disposal. All together, it's called the materials economy. Well, I looked into it a little bit more. In fact, I spent 10 years traveling the world, tracking where our stuff comes from and where it goes. And you know what I found out? That is not the whole story. There is a lot missing from this explanation. For one thing, this system looks like it's fine. No problem. But the truth is, it's a system in crisis. And the reason it's a system in crisis is it's a linear system and we live on a finite planet. And you cannot run a linear system on a finite planet indefinitely. Every step along the way, this system is interacting with the real world. In real life, it's not happening on a blank white page. It's interacting with societies, cultures, economies, the environment. And all along the way, it's bumping up against limits. Limits we don't see here because the diagram is incomplete. So let's go back through. Let's fill in some of the blanks and see what's missing. Well, one of the most important things that's missing is people. Yes, people. People live and work all along this system. And some people in this system matter a little more than others. Some have a little more say. Who are they? Well, let's start with the government. Now, my friends tell me I should use a tank to symbolize the government, and that's true in many countries and increasingly in our own. After all, more than 50% of our federal tax money is now going to the military. But I'm using a person to symbolize the government because I hold true to the vision and values the government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. It's the government's job to watch out for us, to take care of us. That's their job. Then along came the corporation. Now, the reason the corporation looks bigger than the government is that the corporation is bigger than the government. Of the 100 largest economies on Earth now, 51 are corporations. And as the corporation has grown in size and power, we've seen a little change in the government where they're a little more concerned in making sure everything's working out for those guys than for us. Okay, so let's see what else is missing from this picture. We'll start with extraction, which is a fancy word for natural resource exploitation, which is a fancy word for trashing the planet. What this looks like is we chop down the trees, we blow up mountains to get the metals inside, we use up all the water, and we wipe out the animals. So here we are running up against our first limit. We are running out of resources. We are using too much stuff. Now, I know this can be hard to hear, but it's the truth, so we've got to deal with it. In the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resource base has been consumed. Gone. We are cutting and mining and hauling and trashing the place so fast that we're undermining the planet's very ability for people to live here. Where I live, in the United States, we have less than 4% of our original forests left. 40% of the waterways have become undrinkable. And our problem is not just that we're using too much stuff, but we're using more than our share. We have 5% of the world's population, but we're using 30% of the world's resources and creating 30% of the world's waste. If everybody consumed at US rates, we would need 3 to 5 planets. And you know what? We've only got 1. So my country's response to this limitation is simply to go take somebody else's. This is the third world, which some would say is another word for our stuff that somehow got on somebody else's land. So what does that look like? The same thing, trashing the place. 75% of global fisheries now are fished at or beyond capacity. 80% of the planet's original forests are gone. In the Amazon alone, we're losing 2,000 trees a minute. That is 7 football fields a minute. And what about the people who live here? Well, according to these guys, they don't own these resources, even if they've been living there for generations. They don't own the means of production, and they're not buying a lot of stuff. And in this system, if you don't own or buy a lot of stuff, you don't have value. So next, the materials move to production. And what happens there is we use energy to mix toxic chemicals in with the natural resources to make toxic contaminated products. There are over 100,000 synthetic chemicals in use in commerce today. Only a handful of them have even been tested for health impacts, and none have been tested for synergistic health impacts. That means when they interact with all the other chemicals we're exposed to every day. So we don't know the full impact on health and the environment of all these toxic chemicals, but we do know one thing: toxics in, toxics out. As long as we keep putting toxics into our industrial production systems, we're going to keep getting toxics in the stuff that we bring into our homes and workplaces and schools, and our bodies.
Okay.
Like BFRs, brominated
so
flame
we can
retardants.
pause it now. So that piece is 20 minutes long, but that's a little taste of it. And Story of Stuff was a really successful piece because it took what is obviously a pretty complicated topic, the entire materials economy, and found a way to distill it into a pretty simple message with a very simple animation style. To date, we launched it in December of 2007. To date, it's been seen over 12 million times. It was on the Colbert Show. It's been covered in the New York Times a few times. There's been some controversies in the United States where teachers who have shown this piece in schools have actually been asked to resign because they work in very conservative school districts. And you know, this message is considered to be, you know, it incites some debate and it gets people talking about things. So it's been a very successful piece. And what it did, one of the important things to know about it was that when the Story of Stuff was created, the original chunk of money that was put towards it was given by an organization, a foundation called the Tides Foundation. And the Tides Foundation has a lot of different organizations that it works with, you know, to serve a lot of organizations who are working on a lot of the issues that are, you know, entry points all along that system. So people who are working on getting incinerators out of communities in the third world, people who are working on, you know, the production side of things, the sustainable production side of things, all along that system, there are a lot of organizations who are working on those different issues. And so the Tides Foundation gave funding to the piece, and Annie Leonard, who's the star of the piece, who used to be an activist with Greenpeace and spent almost 30 years traveling the world and working on issues around incinerators. They basically collaborated with Free Range to create this piece. And one of the things that was really important as we created it was thinking about who all the different organizations were. And when I was talking before about the idea of the choir, that was really essential in terms of the success of this piece, because we worked to craft the message. The script is incredibly carefully crafted so that all of the different groups and all of the different people who are really passionate about this topic were able to identify themselves in this story and use it as a tool to basically reach out to their audiences and reach out to their email lists and get people inspired about it. And then the piece picked up momentum. Annie said when we first started the piece, she said that she would have considered it a success if 50,000 people saw it. And back in 2007, she didn't even know what a blog was at that point. And we reached 50,000 people, I think, in the first like 2 or 3 days of the piece being launched. So we got to see how it then reached out to the mainstream audience. We were hearing from, you know, people in the Midwest of the United States, people from, you know, all around the world who had been really impacted by it. So what we did was we actually took the success of the piece and we thought about, well, how can we turn this into a bit of a franchise? Like, what are the issues that are being talked about in this piece that we could dive deeper into? Because we had clearly created a platform that we could, you know, open up the issues and talk about a lot more stuff that had been brought up in the movie. So we created a series, and I'm going to show a little bit of this film. This is called The Story of Bottled Water. And we made a film about the story of electronics and the story of cosmetics. And we're about to launch a piece that we're really excited about in the 1st of March, which is going to be about corporations, and particularly about a case in the United States called Citizens United versus FEC, which gave corporations the right to unlimited campaign finance contributions by claiming that they had free speech rights under the First Amendment, which is a very complicated issue, but it's at the core of a lot of major issues with corporations and corporate accountability. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the story of bottled water, which we chose to do this story because we wanted to talk more about the concept of manufactured demand. And we wanted to take a very simple consumer topic, like plastic bottles of water, and we wanted to open that up and get people thinking about a larger framework of this concept that's very much used in advertising, which is the concept of manufactured demand. So I'll play a few minutes of this piece.
This is a story about a world obsessed with stuff. It's a story about a system in crisis. We're trashing the planet, we're trashing each other, and we're not even having fun. The good thing is that when we start to understand the system, we start to see lots of places to step in and turn these problems into solutions. One of the problems with trying to use less stuff is that sometimes we feel like we really need it. What if you live in a city like, say, Cleveland, and you want a glass of water? Are you going to take your chances and get it from the city tap? Or should you reach for a bottle of water that comes from the pristine rainforest of Fiji? Well, Fiji brand water thought the answer to this question was obvious, so they built a whole ad campaign around it. It turned out to be one of the dumbest moves in advertising history. You see, the city of Cleveland didn't like being the butt of Fiji's jokes, so they did some tests, and guess what? These tests showed a glass of Fiji water is lower quality, it loses taste tests against Cleveland Tap, and costs thousands of times more. This story is typical of what happens when you test bottled water against tap water. Is it cleaner? Sometimes, sometimes not. In many ways, bottled water is less regulated than tap. Is it tastier? In taste tests across the country, people consistently choose tap over bottled water. These bottled water companies say they're just meeting consumer demand. But who would demand a less sustainable, less tasty, way more expensive product, especially when you can get for almost free in your kitchen? Bottled water costs about 2,000 times more than tap water. Can you imagine paying 2,000 times the price of anything else? How about a $10,000 sandwich? Yet people in the U.S. buy more than 500 million bottles of water every week. That is enough to circle the globe more than 5 times. How did this come to be? Well, it all goes back to how our materials economy works, and one of its key drivers, which is known as manufactured demand. If companies want to keep growing, they have to keep selling more and more stuff. In the 1970s, giant soft drink companies got worried as they saw their growth projections starting to level off. There's only so much soda a person can drink. Plus, it wouldn't be long before people began realizing soda is not that healthy and turned back to, gasp, drinking tap water. Well, the companies found their next big idea in a silly designer product that most people laughed off as a passing yuppie fad. Water is free, people said back then. What will they sell us next? Air? So how do you get people to buy this fringe product? Simple. You manufacture demand. How do you do that? Well, imagine you're in charge of a bottled water company. Since people aren't lining up to trade their hard-earned money for your unnecessary product, you make them feel scared and insecure if they don't have it. And that's exactly what the bottled water industry did. One of their first marketing tactics was to scare people about tap water with ads like Fiji's Cleveland campaign. When we're done, one top water executive said, tap water will be relegated to showers and washing dishes. Next, you hide the reality of your product behind images of pure fantasy. Have you ever noticed how bottled water tries to seduce us with pictures of mountain streams and pristine nature? But guess where 1/3 of all bottled water in the U.S. actually comes from? The tap. Pepsi's Aquafina and Coke's Dasani are 2 of the many brands that are really filtered tap water. But the pristine nature lie goes much deeper. In a recent full-page ad, Nestle said, bottled water is the most environmentally responsible consumer product in the world. What? They are trashing the environment all along the product's life cycle. Exactly how is that environmentally responsible? The problems start here with extraction and production, where oil is used to make water bottles. Each year, making the plastic water bottles used in the U.S. takes enough oil and energy to fuel 1 million cars. All that energy spent to make the bottle, even more to ship it around the planet, and then we drink it in about 2 minutes? That brings us to the big problem at the other end of the life cycle, disposal. What happens to all these bottles when we're done? 80% end up in landfills, where they will sit for thousands of years, or in incinerators, where they are burned, releasing toxic pollution. The rest gets collected for recycling. I was curious about where the plastic bottles that I put in the recycling bins go. I found out that shiploads were being sent to India, so I went there. I will never forget riding over a hill outside Madras, where I came face to face with a mountain of plastic bottles from California. Now, real recycling would turn these bottles back into bottles. But that wasn't what was happening here. Instead, these bottles were slated to be downcycled, which means turning them into lower quality products that would just be chucked later. The parts that couldn't be downcycled were thrown away there, shipped all the way to India just to be dumped in someone else's backyard.
That piece is about 7 minutes long, so I showed you about half of it. And that piece was also very successful. I mean, at this point, it's been seen, almost 1.5 million times. It's been featured on numerous high-profile blogs. It brought more site visits. I mean, this is an example. There was a coalition of groups that worked as, content partners on this piece, which goes back to that model that I was talking about, where organizations, you think about if you want to create pieces of media like this, think about the different groups who you could pull together, to really leverage to get a piece like this out. Corporate Accountability International was one of the groups that we worked with on the piece, and basically, in 1 week, because of this piece of media, they had more signups and site visits than they would typically get over 2 months. So you can see how these pieces of media can be really effective tools for organizing and for organizations and companies to get positive messages out. This next piece that I'm going to show you is a piece that we did. This is a live action video that we did for an organization called Save the Bay, which is an organization based in San Francisco. And they wanted to create a piece that was going to help them to pass a plastic bag ban in the Bay Area. And so we created this short piece for them. So that piece was a very successful piece for Save the Bay. One of the things that we were really happy with was that it actually helped to bring about a ban on single-use plastic bags and paper carryout bags at city retailers, which was a really big victory. So the Bay Area is doing pretty well in terms of eliminating that kind of disposable product from its materials pipeline. Again, the piece in terms of getting people to know who Save the Bay who Save the Bay is as an organization, and help them to build their email list. It drove site traffic to their website. In 1 week, it was more than they would get average in 1 month. It was covered by a lot of local media outlets. It was on ABC News, and it was just a really successful little piece for them. And the next piece I'm going to talk about is a piece that we did for an organization called the Alliance for Climate Education. One thing that's really fun about this piece is that this is actually not an online piece. This piece is, we created a national high school assembly program in the United States. The Alliance for Climate Education came to us and they wanted to do something that was, basically, it's a little bit like Inconvenient Truth in the model that they have educators who are going to high schools, like in cities all across the United States, to deliver this presentation. And the presentation is about 45 minutes long. Again, I'm only going to show you guys a few minutes. But the presentation is a mixture of live action video, animation, and for the animated sections, the piece that I'm going to show you right here has voiceover embedded in the piece. But what would typically happen is that the animation would play with the sound effects, and the educator would be on stage in front of live action high school audiences and deliver the script. So it's kind of got this interactive, fun feeling that really kind of connects with the audience. But here's just a couple minutes of this piece.
A while back, scientists discovered that the Earth has a sort of giant thermostat that controls the temperature of the planet. And these days, that thermostat is being jacked up, way up. Why? Well, technically, it's all about greenhouse gases and fossil fuels. But when you really get down to it, it's about you and the choices you make. In 2009, you inherited an America that's all about living large. No, not like that, though some people are. Most people are living large and don't even know it. What I mean is, we're each taking up a ton of space. But that isn't easy to see because each of us covers just a little bit of ground. Your room and your stuff cover just a little more. Count your home and, well, yeah, you take up some space. But then there's all that space you're using that you never see. I mean the space in Iowa it takes to grow your food, or in Brazil and China to get the materials to make all your stuff, or in the Middle East to get the fuel to get you where you need to go. And then there's the space in India it takes to dump your stuff when it turns into garbage. You see, everything you buy, use, and eventually throw away has to go somewhere, and you take up that space too. Whether you live in a mansion or a little apartment, whether your family is loaded or broke, if you're an American right now, you're living pretty large. Can you believe that a regular American teenager right now, like you, needs 23 football fields worth of Earth's resources to live? I mean, you didn't choose to live this way. You were born into a world made by your parents and their parents, so you kind of got stuck living large. Add that to the fact that every day since you were like 1 year old, advertisers have been telling you that you could be cooler by having more, and making you proud to be living as large as you can. So whether you like it or not, you have your 23 fields. You want to know what that's like? Line them up end to end.
So this piece goes on for, this section of the assembly is about 10 minutes long, and what it goes on to explain is how lifestyle choices, the kind of framework that we're setting up here relates to CO2, and how CO2 relates to changes in climate and changes in temperature for the planet. So they really wanted, the project needed to be hard science, but they wanted it to be told in a way that was really engaging and exciting for young people. And it's basically been, the organization is just a little over a year old, and so in basically just about a year and 3 months, they've reached over 600,000 high school students. There were partnerships with the X Games, which brought in some major X Games athletes into the project. They have programs in New York City, Denver, Houston, Atlanta, Austin, Boston, San Francisco, and some other cities. So even though that's not an online program, they obviously have a whole social media campaign. They're using Facebook, they're using Twitter, they're engaging students. They have students who are making their own videos. So the Alliance for Climate Education has really built a very robust campaign and presence for themselves online by using this kind of simple messaging techniques, getting across hard science, but doing so in a way that makes it fun and engaging. And the last piece that I'm going to show you guys is a short piece we did for an international campaign, 350.org. And 350.org is a campaign that was started by a man named Bill McKibben. And he started this with a few students from a college in Vermont called Middlebury. And the purpose of this piece was to really brand the number 350. They wanted to get out into the world internationally that the number 350 was crucial as far as an understanding of parts per million of carbon in our atmosphere. And so the task for us with this project was to create a piece that used no language. So there's no script, but it basically needed to communicate effectively what 350 was and also how to activate and how to get people engaged around the campaign. So that piece basically has helped 350 to really brand their campaign. And at this point, on October 10th of 2010, they had another worldwide campaign where people took actions in their communities and documented the actions. So 350, if you guys don't know about it, definitely check it out. They have actions all over the world, and people photograph and document what they've done in their communities. And it's really built quite a presence and is kind of branded as a campaign that has a lot of involvement from grassroots communities. And you can really see people participating in an awareness about 350 and also what they can do at the grassroots level in their communities to combat climate change. So that is a little taste of free-range storytelling. And here's an invitation, to get out there and start telling some stories. And I think we're going to get into some Q&A now. And I appreciate your guys' time, and I hope you like that little tour of some of our pieces of media.